The hum of roaring Harley-Davidsons filled the quiet residential street, the thunderous engines vibrating the ground beneath the tires. The riders, men clad in black leather, tattoos stretching across their muscled arms, were the kind of men who had made names for themselves on the road, earning respect from fear and power. The air was thick with the smell of gasoline and leather as they slowly rolled into the street, their bikes purring like hungry beasts. But amidst this sea of rough men, a tiny figure stood on the corner, almost swallowed by the chaos of their arrival. A small girl, no older than 7, stood alone, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Bike for sale, $20. The sign was crooked, the handwriting messy, but the words were clear. Her pink bicycle, worn but full of charm, sat beside her. The basket slightly askew, its color fading in the harsh sunlight. The moment the biker's engine stilled, a strange silence fell over the scene. It wasn't the usual bustling noise you'd expect from a group of men used to their dominance in the streets. It was a quiet reverence, a stunned pause that seemed to say everything about the situation. Kesha, the little girl, stood perfectly still, her wide eyes darting nervously between the bikers and the dilapidated house behind her. A ragged curtain twitched in the window, the only sign that anyone else was in the house. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her face too innocent, too young to be carrying the weight of such an unimaginable burden. Jake Storm Morrison, leader of the Asphalt Knights, took off his helmet slowly, his weathered hands trembling slightly. He had spent 45 years riding the roads, navigating through trouble, pain, and violence. He was no stranger to the harsh realities of life, nor the brokenness of the world. Yet, in front of him, this small child stood offering her most prized possession for something as simple as a meal. There was something about the way she held the sign, the trembling in her small hands, the way she refused to meet their eyes. It was a quiet dignity, a kind of selflessness that cut through the noise of the world. And in that moment, it struck Jake deeper than any punch he had ever received. He didn't want to be the man who took advantage of her, the man who saw her as just another face in a world of broken dreams. No, he had seen enough of that. Too much. And this little girl was different. "Hey, princess," Jake said, his voice rough from years of use, but gentle in the way it reached her ears. He crouched down to her level, making sure she didn't feel threatened. "How much for the bike?" Kesha hesitated for a moment, her small fingers clutching the cardboard sign tightly. She looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, her voice barely audible. $20, sir." Her words wavered, and for a second, it seemed like the weight of the world was on her tiny shoulders. $20. Jake repeated softly, his voice more questioning than anything else. The bike, though worn, was clearly her most valuable possession. And it wasn't just a bike, it was a symbol of her childhood, of innocence. She had probably spent hours on it, imagining herself racing through the streets, her imagination running wild with the wind in her hair. But now, that small piece of joy was being sold for food. "Why are you selling it, princess?" Jake asked, his voice more tender than he intended. Kesha's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back, refusing to let them spill. "Mummy hasn't eaten in 3 days, she murmured, her voice barely more than a whisper. She said, "I can sell my bike to buy food." The other bikers, Thunder, Scar, and Bull, exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen poverty before. They had seen people desperate enough to give up their most prized possessions just to survive. But there was something about Kesha's offering that was different. It wasn't desperation, it was the quiet dignity of a child who had been forced to grow up too quickly. The kind of grace that only the truly innocent could possess. Jake stood up slowly, his mind racing. He had seen the signs, the thinness in Kesha's face, the way she avoided eye contact, the shame in her voice. It wasn't just about hunger. This wasn't just a little girl trying to survive. There was a story here, and it was one he couldn't ignore. He turned to Bull, his voice low but commanding. "Go to the store on the corner. Buy everything a child and a sick mother need for a week. I don't care what it costs." Bull hesitated for a moment, but didn't question him. He knew when Jake gave an order, there was no room for argument. Bull turned and jogged down the street toward the corner store, his large frame moving quickly despite his bulk. Jake turned back to Kesha, crouching down to her level again, his voice softening. "You don't need to sell your bike, princess. But I need you to tell me something. Who fired your mum?" Kesha's eyes, wide and innocent just moments before, now burned with a kind of raw anger that Jake hadn't expected. "The man in the big office," she muttered, her tiny hands curling into fists. "He said, my mum was expendable. That people like us are easy to replace." The anger in her voice took Jake by surprise. He had expected a sense of sadness, of fear. But this was different. This was a pure, unfiltered rage. It was the kind of anger that only a child could carry, innocent and untainted, yet heavy enough to break the hearts of anyone who heard it. Jake stood up slowly, his face hardening as he absorbed her words. For 45 years, he had lived on the fringes of society. He had been rejected by the world, pushed aside because of his past. But this was something else. This wasn't just about bad luck or misfortune. This was about systemic cruelty. About a world where people like Kesha and her mother were discarded like yesterday's trash. "Bull," Jake called out, not taking his eyes off Kesha. "Go to that store and get everything you can. I'm not letting this slide." As Bull disappeared down the street, Jake's mind churned. He had always known that people in power didn't care about those on the bottom. But this was a man Richard Hartwell using his wealth and influence to destroy lives. And he had just made a mistake. Jake turned to Kesha, crouching down once more, his voice calm but firm. "You won't have to sell your bike today, princess. I promise." Kesha nodded, the faintest glimmer of hope appearing in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Jake," she whispered. Jake stood up and faced the direction where Bull had gone. He knew this was just the beginning. This wasn't just about helping a little girl with her bike. This was about something much bigger, about standing up to a world that thought people like Kesha and her mother were disposable. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the street. The quiet hum of the neighborhood was broken only by the occasional car passing by, or the distant sound of a dog barking. But in the small house where Kesha lived, the noise was different, a sharp, aching silence that hung heavily in the air. Jake stood still on the corner, his mind racing as he watched the little girl clutch the pink bicycle, her small frame barely visible against the harsh backdrop of poverty. He had seen his share of hardship in his life. He wasn't a stranger to the kind of struggles that come with living on the margins of society. But there was something about this moment that felt different. The way Kesha held on to the sign, the way she offered up the one thing that might have been her only possession of true value, it felt like a desperate plea for help. And no one should ever have to be put in that position. As the bikers stood around her, exchanging uneasy glances, Jake couldn't help but feel a pang of anger rise within him. This wasn't just about a little girl selling her bike for food. It was about something much bigger. The system that allowed this to happen, that forced people like Kesha and her mother into a corner where they had no choice but to sell their dignity. He'd seen it before. Families torn apart by poverty, by sickness, by an unforgiving world. But this felt different. It felt personal. "Bull," Jake called over to his companion, his voice low but filled with a commanding authority. "Go to the store on the corner. Get everything a child and a sick mother need for a week. Food, medicine, clothes, everything." Bull, a massive man who had been part of Jake's crew for years, didn't hesitate. He understood. He'd seen the same things Jake had seen. They were brothers in this fight, bound by a code that didn't just protect their own, but anyone who was powerless, anyone who needed a hand. Bull turned and walked away without another word, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement as he made his way down the street. Jake turned back to Kesha, crouching down so that he was at eye level with her. He needed her to know that she wasn't alone in this moment, that her bravery didn't go unnoticed, and even if no one else cared, he did. "You don't need to sell your bike, princess," Jake said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness that few would expect from a man who had lived a life filled with violence and darkness. His gaze softened as he looked at her, seeing the courage in her small face. But I need to ask you something, Kesha. Who fired your mum? The question was simple, but it held more weight than anything else in that moment. Kesha's face, which had been a mixture of fear and resolve, flickered with a new emotion. Pure, unbridled anger. The kind of anger that only a child exposed to injustice could carry. It wasn't the kind of anger born from petty squabbles or childish tantrums. This was the kind of fury that burned deep within the soul. Born of years of being treated as less than human, of being invisible in a world that didn't care. The man in the big office. Kesha muttered, her voice filled with bitterness. He said, "My mum was expendable. Said people like us are easy to replace." Jake stood up slowly, a deep, growing sense of righteousness filling his chest. He had heard those words before, those words that had been used to justify cruelty, to strip away the humanity of people like Kesha and her mother. He had faced that kind of thinking himself, men like Richard Hartwell, the CEO who had fired Kesha's mother, using his power to crush those beneath him without a second thought. Jake had seen it before in the world of business, in the corporate games that allowed the rich to thrive while the poor were left to struggle. But this was different. This wasn't just another person lost in the corporate machine. This wasn't just about bad luck or a job gone wrong. This was personal. Jake turned to the other bikers, his voice low but filled with the kind of anger that could only come from knowing the truth. This isn't about bad luck. This is about a man who thinks he's above everyone else. A man who doesn't see people like Kesha and her mum as worth his time. People like them, people like us, are expendable to him. The other bikers stood silently, processing the weight of what Jake had said. They knew what it felt like to be cast aside, to be looked down upon by those who thought their money and power made them better. But this was a whole new level of injustice. "Bull," Jake called again, his voice harder this time. "Go to that store and get everything a child and a sick mother need. We're not letting this slide." Kesha's eyes, which had been full of uncertainty just moments before, now sparkled with a glimmer of hope. She couldn't believe it. The bikers, the men who everyone feared, were going to help her. They weren't going to take advantage of her. They weren't going to treat her like everyone else had. They were going to make sure that she didn't have to give up her bike, the last thing she had to hold on to. Jake crouched down again, gently touching the handlebars of the pink bicycle. "You don't have to sell this today, princess. But you've got to tell me something else. Who fired your mum? I need to know." Kesha hesitated for a moment, then spoke in a voice that was filled with both pain and clarity. "The man in the big office. Mr. Richard Hartwell. He said I'm not good enough. That people like us, were just disposable." Jake's jaw clenched. The name rang in his ears like a warning bell. Richard Hartwell. He'd heard of him before, had even crossed paths with him years ago when he'd been fired from his factory job. It was the same man who had fired him and dozens of others because of their pasts, because of their records. He was the kind of man who thought his money and connections made him untouchable. And now, he had done it again. He had destroyed a family just like he had done to Jake and countless others. Jake straightened up, his face a mask of determination. "Bull," he called again, his voice calm but intense. "I want you to get everything. And when you're done, we're going after Hartwell." The night grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the street. The sounds of the city had quieted down, but in the small rundown house behind Kesha, the quiet was suffocating. The faint murmur of the television from inside was the only sign of life. A weak attempt to cover up the emptiness of the home, Jake stood in the middle of the street, his leather-clad frame towering over Kesha's small figure, his thoughts racing. The situation was much bigger than he had first realized. This wasn't just about a bike or a sick mother. This was a story of injustice that ran deeper, one that stretched far beyond the confines of this street, beyond Kesha and her mother. Lisa. Jake had lived most of his life on the fringes of society, surviving on the streets, in the shadows where people were forgotten. But what he had just learned about Richard Hartwell, the CEO of Hartwell Industries, struck a chord deep inside him. Hartwell wasn't just another businessman in a suit. He was the type of man who thought he could control everything with money and power. And now, He was pulling the strings that had caused this little girl and her mother to suffer. The other bikers stood by, their expressions hard, their muscles taut with tension. Thunder, Scar, and Bull all knew Jake well enough to understand what was coming next. There was no turning back now. The blood in their veins ran hot with a shared sense of justice, of righting a wrong they couldn't ignore. Thunder, the tech-savvy biker who had a knack for digging into people's lives, was the first to speak. "I've been looking into Hartwell Industries," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "This isn't just about firing people. It's a pattern. He's been systematically cutting down employees who don't fit his profile. The ones who are too old, too sick, too... different." Jake's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the information. He'd seen it before: rich men playing God with people's lives, pulling them from the margins and casting them aside as if they were expendable. But Hartwell's actions went beyond just profit. This was personal. It was about creating a world where only the right people had a place, a world where the rest of them, people like Kesha and her mother, were meant to disappear into the background. "What do you mean by profile?" Jake asked, his voice steady, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Thunder didn't hesitate. "Hartwell has been firing minority employees, including Black and Latino workers. Most of them were the long-term staff, the ones who'd been there for years, the ones who had families to feed. And when they were fired, it wasn't for performance issues. It was because of some new restructuring initiative that looked suspiciously like a cover-up for discrimination." Jake's jaw tightened as Thunder passed him his phone. The screen showed a list of names, the employees who had been fired in the last 2 years, the overwhelming majority of them from disadvantaged communities. The numbers didn't lie. "Look at this," Thunder continued, swiping through the phone. "There's more. Hartwell's company has been laying off people left and right. But if you look at who's been kept, it's almost all white upper-middle-class employees. The ones who don't make waves, the ones who fit the profile." Jake read through the information, his eyes darkening with every line. He had lived through the hard edges of life, seen the way the system worked to keep people down, but this was systematic cruelty disguised as business. He could feel the rage building up in his chest, but more than that, he could feel the weight of responsibility. This wasn't just about Kesha and her mother anymore. This was about everyone who had been wronged, everyone who had been shoved aside by people like Hartwell. "Where's Hartwell now?" Jake asked, his voice low and full of intent. "He's got a charity gala coming up in a few days," Thunder said, tapping on his phone. "It's being held at the Grand Hotel downtown. All the city's elite will be there: businessmen, politicians, influencers. It's the perfect time to expose him." Jake stood still, staring into the distance, his mind racing. This was it. This was their chance to do something that would change everything. But Jake knew that exposing Hartwell wasn't going to be easy. It would take more than just revealing the truth. It would take a plan that would hit Hartwell where it hurt the most: his ego, his reputation, his carefully curated image. "We're going to take him down," Jake said, his voice calm, but carrying a weight of finality. "But we're not just going to expose him. We're going to make sure everyone knows the kind of man he really is. And when we're done, he won't be able to hide behind his shiny suits or his fake charity work." The bikers exchanged looks of determination. They knew Jake well enough to understand the weight behind his words. He wasn't just angry. He wasn't just looking for revenge. What Jake was offering was something deep: justice, pure and simple. "We'll gather everything we need," Jake continued, his eyes still fixed on the house where Kesha and Lisa lived. "We'll get the documents, the recordings, the evidence. And when we walk into that gala, Hartwell will see that the people he's tried to crush, people like Kesha, like Lisa, like OSR, the ones who will make him pay." The determination in Jake's voice made it clear this wasn't a fight for justice. It was a battle for their dignity, for the dignity of everyone who had been overlooked, humiliated, and discarded by the system. As Bull returned with bags of groceries, the tension in the air felt different. It wasn't just about helping Kesha and her mother anymore. It was about standing up to a system that had allowed men like Hartwell to thrive while destroying families in the process. "Princess," Jake said, turning back to Kesha. You won't have to sell your bike today. You won't have to sell anything. I promise you. Kesha looked up at him, the slightest flicker of hope in her eyes. She had been so afraid, so uncertain, but now, in the presence of these rough, intimidating men, she felt something shift. These bikers weren't the kind of men who took advantage of people, they were the kind of men who fought for those who couldn't fight for themselves. I'll make sure you get everything you need, Jake said, standing tall. But first, we're going to make sure Hartwell understands something. What's that? Kesha asked, her voice still small, but filled with a newfound courage. Jake looked down at her, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. That people like you, Princess, are irreplaceable. The night air had grown cooler, and the shadows of the city seemed to stretch longer as Jake and his crew made their way back to their headquarters, a rundown warehouse that had become their base of operations. Inside, the scent of old leather mixed with the faint metallic temps of machines and oil. The large wooden table in the center of the room was cluttered with maps, printouts, and laptops strewn about, each filled with evidence, details, and research gathered over the past few days. Jake ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, staring at the disorganized mess in front of him. But amidst the chaos, a singular truth was emerging. Richard Hartwell was no mere businessman. He was a predator, using his power to pick apart families, to ruin lives, all in the name of corporate profit. And no one had dared to challenge him. Not until now. Thunder, Jake said, his voice heavy with anticipation. What do we have? Thunder, the crew's resident tech expert, sat hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys. It's all here, boss, he said, his voice low but filled with quiet anger. Hartwell Industries has been systematically firing minorities, mostly based on a profile, not performance. Just who they are. And it's been going on for years. Jake felt his blood begin to simmer. Tell me more, he demanded. Thunder scrolled through the documents on his screen. Hartwell's been laying off workers at an alarming rate, especially Black, Latino, and low-income employees. It's all under the guise of necessary restructuring, but the truth is, he's been cleaning house. The numbers don't lie, Jake. The employees who stay are overwhelmingly white. Upper-middle-class people who fit his ideal profile. The ones who get booted out. They're people who have been here for years, working hard, but they don't match his idea of the right kind of people. Jake clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. The injustice of it all burned like a fire in his chest. He had seen his share of corruption and greed, but this was a different kind of evil. It wasn't just about making money, it was about destroying lives. About systematically erasing people from the system because they didn't fit a narrow, bigoted mold. And it had to stop. Who's been let go recently? Jake asked, his voice tight with barely contained rage. Thunder pulled up a list on the screen. A list that grew longer and longer with each click. The names weren't just statistics, they were people, real people with families, with lives that had been torn apart by a man who thought he could do whatever he wanted because he had the power and money to get away with it. Jake studied the list closely, his mind working furiously. One name stood out: Lisa Rodriguez, the woman Kesha had mentioned. She had worked for Hartwell Industries for years, never once missing a shift, even when she had been sick. And now, according to the documents, she had been fired under the pretext of company restructuring. Lisa Rodriguez, Jake muttered to himself, his mind reeling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. How could he do this? Thunder's eyes were fixed on his screen as he spoke again, his voice low with disgust. Jake, you need to see this. It's not just Lisa. There's a pattern. And it goes much deeper than simple layoffs. Hartwell's been targeting employees who have been with the company for a long time. People who don't fit his profile. People of color. People from disadvantaged communities. Jake took a deep breath, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had seen this kind of thing before, people in power using their positions to manipulate and control. To decide who was worthy of a job, of a future. But this was systematic, calculated, cold. And it made Jake sick to his stomach. Where's the proof? Jake asked, his voice low but sharp. Thunder pulled up more files on his laptop, each one more damning than the last. I've been going through Hartwell's emails. He's been giving direct orders to HR to fire employees based on their race, their socioeconomic status, and their appearance. There's a whole file of instructions on how to justify these firings. There are even recordings of meetings where Hartwell himself talks about the need to clean up the company to better suit his vision for the future. Jake's mind began to churn, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Hartwell wasn't just firing people to cut costs, he was purging the company of anyone who didn't meet his narrow definition of success. And he wasn't just destroying lives, he was doing it in a way that no one would notice, that no one would question. The biker crew was silent as they absorbed the full scope of the corruption. They knew Jake well enough to understand that he wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't just going to expose Hartwell, he was going to make sure the world saw him for what he truly was. Scar. Bull, Jake said, his voice filled with resolve. We need to talk to the other employees who were fired. I want to hear their stories, every word, every detail. We're going to build a case against him, and we're going to make sure it sticks. Scar and Bull nodded, both men understanding what needed to be done. They had all seen what happened when men like Hartwell were allowed to operate unchecked. They had seen families destroyed, people discarded like they didn't matter, but now, they had the chance to do something about it. Later that evening, as the crew regrouped at their headquarters, the evidence was clear. Hartwell was not just a corrupt businessman. He was a man who had built his fortune on the backs of the people he had oppressed. The records, the testimonies, the emails, they all pointed in one direction, and it was time to expose the truth. But Jake wasn't just thinking about the business side of things. He was thinking about Lisa, about Kesha, about the families that had been torn apart by a man who thought he could play God. And he knew that taking down Hartwell was only the beginning. We're not just going to expose him, Jake said, his voice filled with quiet fury. We're going to make sure he understands what it means to mess with people like us, people who won't be forgotten, people who will fight for what's right. The rest of the crew nodded in agreement, their resolve as unshakable as Jake's. This wasn't just about taking down a businessman, it was about sending a message that no one, no matter how much money or power they had, could escape the consequences of their actions. Tomorrow, we start getting the word out, Jake said, his voice steady. Hartwell is going to learn what it means to face the truth. The warehouse was buzzing with energy. Papers scattered across the wooden table, maps of Hartwell Industries, photos of employees who had been wrongfully fired, and printouts of corporate emails filled the air with the promise of something big. Jake stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed over his chest, his piercing eyes scanning the room. His crew, the 4 men who had stood by him through countless fights and hardships, sat around the table, their faces hard, their expressions filled with grim determination. Thunder, Scar, and Bull were all there, each of them with a role to play. But this was different. This wasn't just about getting a job done, it was about sending a message. A message to Hartwell, to the system, and to anyone who thought they could destroy lives without facing consequences. Jake's blood boiled as he thought about Kesha's face, the way she had stood in front of him with that heartbreaking sign, the way her small hands had trembled as she offered up her bike for the chance to feed her family. We've got the proof, Jake said, his voice steady but tinged with anger. He leaned forward, pointing to the screen where a series of images and documents were displayed. Hartwell's company has been systematically targeting employees, firing people of color, people from disadvantaged communities, people who don't fit his profile. And he's been doing it for years. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle in the room. The crew knew what was at stake. They'd seen the evidence Thunder had uncovered, the emails where Hartwell had ordered his HR department to specifically target minorities, and the long list of fired employees who had done nothing but show up and do their jobs. It wasn't just corporate restructuring, it was discrimination, pure and simple. But it's not enough just to expose him, Jake continued. We need to make sure Hartwell pays for what he's done. He's been hiding behind his wealth, behind his connections. It's time we take those away from him. Bull, always the quiet one, slammed his fist on the table. What's the plan, Jake? How are we going to hit him where it hurts? Jake looked over at his crew, his eyes steely with resolve. We do this publicly. We're going to expose him in front of the whole city. The gala's coming up in a few days, and we're going to be there. We're going to bring his whole empire crashing down around him. It's time everyone knows the truth about Richard Hartwell. Scar leaned forward, his rough hands gripping the edge of the table. You think we can pull this off? Get everything we need in time? Jake nodded slowly. We've got the evidence. Thunder's been working on getting all the files, the recordings, and the internal emails. Bull and Scar are going to talk to more of the employees Hartwell fired. We're going to get their stories, their testimonies. And Sandra's already got the legal documentation ready. We have everything we need to make sure Hartwell can't wiggle out of this. Thunder spoke up, his voice tinged with excitement. I've hacked into the event's audio-visual system. We've got control of the screens, the microphones, everything. The moment Hartwell starts his speech, we'll take over the presentation. It'll be a live broadcast of everything he's done. The whole city will see it. Jake's lips curled into a small, satisfied smile. Exactly. We'll start with the emails, the recordings. Then we'll show the faces of the people he's fired. Their stories will speak louder than anything we could say. And when we're done, Hartwell will never be able to hide again. There was a brief silence in the room as the weight of the plan settled in. This wasn't just a fight for Kesha and Lisa anymore. It was a fight for everyone Hartwell had hurt, for everyone who had been crushed under the weight of his greed. And Jake wasn't going to stop until every single one of those people got justice. The plan was clear, and they all knew their roles. But there was something else, something deeper that drove them all. Jake had seen enough of the world's cruelty to last a lifetime. He had fought in the shadows for years, but now, for the first time, he was fighting in the light. And he wasn't doing it for revenge, he was doing it because it was the right thing to do. We do this right, and it's over for him, Jake said, his voice firm. Hartwell's going to lose everything. His company, his reputation, his so-called legacy, it all comes crashing down in front of the people he's tried to destroy. The next few days were a whirlwind. The crew worked tirelessly, gathering all the evidence they needed. Thunder worked behind the scenes, pulling up Hartwell's financial records, exposing his manipulation of the company's internal systems. Scar and Bull continued their interviews with the fired employees, gathering testimonies that would tear Hartwell's carefully constructed empire apart. Meanwhile, Jake worked on perfecting the plan, making sure every detail was covered. They couldn't afford to fail. Jake found himself at the warehouse late one night, reviewing the documents one last time. The phone call with Sandra had gone well. She had provided the final pieces of the puzzle. The evidence was irrefutable. Now, it was time to make sure the world knew the truth. Kesha's face kept coming back to him. The way she had looked at him, so full of hope and fear. She had trusted him, and he wouldn't let her down. He had made a promise to that little girl. A promise to make sure Hartwell never hurt anyone again. He stood up, taking a deep breath. "All right, boys," he said, his voice calm but filled with determination. "We've got one shot at this. We go in, expose Hartwell, and make sure everyone knows what he's done. This is bigger than any of us. We're going to make sure that no one, not even Hartwell, gets away with this." The crew gathered around, their faces set with the same resolve. They had been through battles before on the road, in their personal lives, in the world that had rejected them. But this was different. This wasn't just about the four of them. This was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against them. "We ride at dawn," Jake said, his eyes burning with the fire of justice. "And when we get to that gala, we show the city who Richard Hartwell really is. We show them what happens when you think you can destroy lives and get away with it." The air in the Grand Hotel downtown felt thick with anticipation, as if everyone present knew something was about to change, but none of them knew just how. The sparkling chandeliers above cast a golden light over the glitzy crowd, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floors, their voices rising in polite murmurs. It was a night of celebration, of lavish indulgence, and of recognition. And at the center of it all stood Richard Hartwell, the CEO of Hartwell Industries, who was about to receive the Entrepreneur of the Year award, an honor that, in his mind, was long overdue. But Jake knew better. He had seen the lies behind Hartwell's smile, the exploitation behind his wealth. He had seen how this man had destroyed lives like Lisa's, like Keshia's, and he knew that tonight, everything was about to unravel. Jake stood in the shadowed corner of the ballroom, his eyes scanning the crowd. His leather jacket felt heavier than usual tonight, not from the weight of the material, but from the weight of the plan that was about to come to fruition. The bikers Thunder, Scar, and Bull were scattered throughout the hotel, each in position, ready to make their move. Thunder was backstage, ensuring that the event's audio-visual systems were under their control, while Scar and Bull blended in among the waitstaff, ready to pass the crucial documents to the right hands at the right moment. Jake's focus was singular: Richard Hartwell. The man who thought he was untouchable, the man who had fired employees without a second thought, who had manipulated his company's systems to line his pockets while throwing people like Kesha and Lisa to the wolves. The same man who stood now at the podium, receiving applause for his so-called contributions to the community, oblivious to the storm that was about to break over him. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great honor that I present to you the Entrepreneur of the Year award, Richard Hartwell. The Master of Ceremonies announced, his voice booming over the microphone. The crowd erupted in applause, the clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversation fading as Hartwell stepped forward, his broad grin flashing in the spotlight. He waved, his smile a mask of charm, as if the whole world adored him. He was the embodiment of success, the poster child for the American dream at least. That was the image he had worked so hard to cultivate. Jake clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he watched Hartwell make his way to the stage. He was just a few steps away from taking the honor he didn't deserve. But Jake knew that this night would be Hartwell's undoing. The truth, as always, had a way of finding its way to the surface, and tonight, it would break free like a flood, sweeping away the lies and the facade Hartwell had built. As Hartwell began his speech, Jake could feel the room's attention shift entirely toward him. His voice carried through the speakers, projecting an air of false humility. "Thank you. Thank you all," Hartwell said, his tone smooth, polished. "It is truly an honor to receive this award. I've worked so hard over the years to build Hartwell Industries into what it is today. But none of this would be possible without the support of my incredible team, and, of course, the community we serve." Jake's eyes narrowed. He had heard these speeches before, rich and title men speaking of their hard work and community contributions, while turning a blind eye to the pain they caused along the way. Hartwell wasn't thanking his team. He wasn't thanking the workers who had made him rich. He was simply using their labor as a stepping stone to further his own ego. But Jake was done watching. He had no more patience for this charade. As the lights dimmed slightly, the giant screen behind Hartwell flickered to life. The image of Hartwell's corporate logo, with its sleek design and polished image, filled the space. But before Hartwell could continue, something unexpected happened. The screen abruptly cut to black. For a split second, there was confusion. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd, followed by the faint sound of whispers. And then, the screen flashed again, but this time, the image that appeared wasn't of Hartwell's polished logo. It was an email from Hartwell himself, one of the many that had been leaked to the public. The words that appeared on the screen were a stark contrast to the glowing image Hartwell had spent years cultivating. "We need to be more selective with our hiring process. High-end clientele expect to see employees who represent our brand appropriately." You know what I mean? The crowd fell into a stunned silence. The text lingered on the screen, bold and glaring for all to see. And then, another image appeared, one that made Jake's blood run cold. It was a list of names, employees who had been fired, their faces highlighted in red. The majority of the names were Black, Latino, and from disadvantaged communities. The crowd's confusion turned to murmurs of disbelief. The applause died down as the reality of what they were witnessing began to sink in. Hartwell stood frozen. his eyes wide with shock as he glanced between the screen and the audience. The carefully crafted image he had spent years building was crumbling before his eyes. His grip on the microphone tightened as his expression faltered. This was no longer the evening he had planned. This was not the celebration of his success. This was his reckoning. And just as quickly as the evidence appeared, it was replaced by another slide. The screen now displayed a series of audio recordings of Hartwell himself, his voice clear and unmistakable, instructing his managers to target specific employees for dismissal based on their race, their background, their status. We can't let our image be compromised by employees who don't fit the corporate profile. Jake stood in the shadows, watching Hartwell's face drain of color. His jaw was clenched, his eyes wide with panic. He was cornered, exposed, his empire of lies crumbling in front of everyone. The crowd began to stir, some looking around in confusion, others staring at the screen, their faces filled with disbelief. The whispers grew louder, and the room began to pulse with tension. But Jake wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but powerful, "before you celebrate this man, you should know the truth. The truth about how he built his empire not on hard work, not on integrity, but on the backs of people he thought were disposable." The room went silent, everyone turning their attention to Jake. The powerful image of Hartwell, once untouchable, now seemed small in comparison to the truth that Jake had just revealed. Hartwell's voice shook as he tried to regain control of the situation. "This is a lie. This is a hack," he yelled, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. But before he could finish his sentence, the screen flashed once more, this time showing the faces of the fired employees. And among them was a photo of Lisa Rodriguez, the woman Kesha had mentioned, her name highlighted in red. The photo of her holding her resignation letter, her tear-streaked face a haunting reminder of the injustice she had suffered. "Do you remember Lisa Rodriguez?" Jake's voice rang out, cutting through the stunned silence. "The woman you publicly humiliated before firing her, for a crime she never committed." Hartwell stumbled backward, his face pale, his hands trembling. The moment he thought was his moment of glory was now his downfall. Jake's words struck harder than any punch ever could. The crowd began to stir, murmurs of disbelief turning into calls for justice. Cameras flashed, phones were raised, and reporters scrambled to capture the unfolding spectacle. Hartwell's world, the world he had so carefully constructed, was crumbling. Jake stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "Hartwell thinks he can get away with destroying families. He thinks he can ruin lives and then smile for the cameras. But tonight, we're exposing the truth." The morning after the gala, the city felt different. The air was sharper, the streets seemed less crowded, and for the first time in years, there was a palpable shift in the way people looked at the world. The heart of the city, once indifferent to the struggles of its most vulnerable, now carried the weight of justice. Jake Storm Morrison leaned back against the worn leather seat of his Harley, his eyes scanning the street in front of him. The familiar hum of the engine beneath him was a grounding force, something that connected him to the world in a way words never could. But today, things felt different. He wasn't just another biker passing through town. He wasn't just another forgotten man with a past. He was something more. He was a symbol of what could happen when people like him, the ignored, the discarded, decided to fight for what was right. And the city, the very people who had always turned their heads, had witnessed it firsthand. The events of the previous night still echoed in his mind. Richard Hartwell, the man who thought he could crush people like Kesha and her mother, had been exposed for who he truly was, a fraud, a man who used his power to break others without a second thought. And Jake, along with his brothers-in-arms, had made sure that truth was no longer something Hartwell could hide behind. The bikers had done more than just ruin Hartwell's career, they had exposed a system that needed to be torn down. It wasn't just about the business world. It wasn't just about corporate greed. It was about the real people, the ones who worked hard, the ones who sacrificed everything, and the ones who were forgotten because they didn't fit into the narrow vision of success that men like Hartwell held. Jake's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from Sandra, the former accountant who had helped gather the evidence that ultimately brought Hartwell to his knees. "You did it. Jake Hartwell is gone. The community's rising, and the workers are taking their lives back. There's hope now, and people like Kesha, like Lisa, they'll never be invisible again." A small smile tugged at the corner of Jake's mouth as he read the message. Sandra was right. It wasn't just about Hartwell's fall from grace, it was about everyone who had been dismissed, everyone who had been told they didn't matter. Jake hit reply and typed a single sentence. "Justice doesn't need a trophy, it just needs the truth." As he pressed send, he saw Kesha running toward him, her small figure sprinting down the sidewalk. Her new school uniform was crisp, her backpack bouncing as she ran with the kind of joy that only a child who had been given a second chance could express. "Uncle Jake!" Kesha shouted, her face beaming as she reached him. Wrapping her arms around his legs in a tight hug, Jake lifted her up, feeling her warmth and energy fill him with something he hadn't felt in years. "How's the new school, Princess?" he asked, his voice filled with affection. "It's great." Kesha grinned. "I made lots of friends, and I'm learning so much. Mum's doing better too." Her eyes twinkled. She said, "I'm going to be a doctor one day." Jake chuckled, his heart swelling with pride. "Well, if you want to be a doctor, you've got a pretty good start. Kesha, you're already helping your mum just by being you." She smiled, her face lighting up. "I'm going to help lots of people, just like you helped us. And you're going to be proud of me." Jake squeezed her tight. "I already am, Princess." Behind them, Lisa emerged from the small house, her face glowing with health and confidence. She had lost weight, yes, but not from hunger or illness. She had regained control of her life, and her eyes were filled with a strength that was contagious. "Lisa," Jake greeted her. Nodding respectfully, "Jake," Lisa said, her voice steady, filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did. You saved my family. You saved Kesha's future." Her voice wavered slightly, but she held her composure. "But more than that, ... You gave us our dignity back." Jake looked at her, his face softening. "I didn't do it alone, Lisa, it was the Knights. And you, your strength, your love for Keshath, that's what made this happen. You didn't give up, and neither did we." Lisa stepped closer, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We've got our lives back, Jake, and we'll never forget what you did. You didn't just bring me groceries or help me pay my bills. You brought justice. You gave me hope. You gave Kesha a future." Kesha, who had been silently watching, tugged at Jake's sleeve, pulling his attention back to her. "Uncle Jake, we're opening a bakery with the settlement money. We're starting fresh. And I'm going to make the best cookies ever. You'll be the first customer, okay?" Jake chuckled, his heart full. "I'll be there every day, Kesha. You'll make the best cookies in the world." It wasn't long before the full repercussions of the scandal hit Hartwell. The company had collapsed. Its stock value plummeted. The public outcry was relentless. The community, once too passive to resist the wealthy elite, had risen. The families that had been affected by Hartwell's discriminatory practices were now taking legal action, fighting for justice with every tool they had. And what about Hartwell himself? His name, once a symbol of corporate success, was now a joke. He had been stripped of his title, his wealth, and his dignity. His mansion was sold off, and his yacht was repossessed. He had gone from the man of the year to the man who could barely pay his bills. In the end, his arrogance had led to his downfall. As for Jake and the Knights, they moved on, each man finding a new purpose in life. Thunder, once a hacker working in the shadows, had started his own tech company, using his skills to fight for social justice. Scar had opened a small motorcycle repair shop, and Bull had bought a mechanic's garage. They were all thriving, but none of them had forgotten the lessons they had learned. They had fought not just for themselves, but for the forgotten, the overlooked, and the oppressed. Jake watched as Kesha rode her pink bike through the small neighborhood, the same bike she had nearly sold for $20. She was laughing, carefree, the wind catching her hair as she pedaled with all her might. It was a moment of pure joy, and Jake couldn't help but feel a deep sense of peace. Lisa came up beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You know," she said softly, "Kesha's right. You gave us a future. We'll never forget that." Jake turned to her, smiling. "You'll make it on your own. I have no doubt about that." Lisa smiled back, the sun glinting off her face as she looked at her daughter. "We've got a good start, thanks to you. And the future, it's ours to build."